Hey guys, tonight we begin with something rarely spoken aloud but lived by half the population for centuries. Imagine a world with no bathtubs, no soap, and no running water. Not because someone forgot to pay the bills, but because those things simply didn't exist. Now picture being a woman in that world, when hygiene wasn't just difficult, it was discouraged, when being clean was seen as strange, even suspicious. Ever skipped a shower and felt uncomfortable? That was daily life for millions of women in the Middle Ages. No bathrooms, no private sinks. Just one room shared by the entire family where you cooked, slept, ate, and, yes, tried to wash yourself behind a curtain made from an old sheet. If you're a man, you might be tempted to skip this part. I promise what you're about to hear will make your skin crawl, not from disgust, but from disbelief. Because once you hear what women had to go through just to keep themselves halfway decent, you'll never complain about 2-in-1 shampoo again. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's step together into the world of medieval women's hygiene place, where dignity had to be carried by hand, one heavy bucket at a time. There were no bathrooms, not in the way we understand them, no sinks, no hot water taps, no tiled walls or fluffy towels, just stone, wood, dirt floors, and a cold basin. If you were lucky, every act of personal hygiene had to be done manually, and often in public or at least semi-public spaces. In the countryside, most families lived in a single room. The same space held your bed, your fire, your cooking pot, your food storage, and your body. There was no privacy, not for washing, not for anything. If a woman wanted to bathe and truly bathe, not just wipe down, she had to start with water. That meant walking, buckets in hand, to a stream, or a communal well, or a rain barrel. The buckets were wood, or clay, or iron-rimmed, heavy even when empty, back-breaking when full, and if she wanted warm water, that meant fire. That meant fuel. That meant choosing between bathing or cooking a meal. Even in wealthier homes, things went dramatically better. Yes, more servants, maybe a side room with a dedicated tub, but still water had to be carried, heated, poured, cleaned. Bathing was work, and for women, bathing was last. She waited her turn like she always did. There was no schedule, no spoken rule, and certainly no written agreement, but everyone in that one-room cottage knew the order of things. The bath came once a month, if they were lucky, and when it did, it belonged to others before it ever touched her skin. The wooden tub sat in the middle of the floor, near the hearth. It wasn't deep, maybe 1.5 feet at best, with rounded sides polished smooth from years of use. Water had been carried for hours to fill it bucket by bucket from the well down the hill, or from the rain barrel if it had been a wet week. Heating it took more time, the fire needed tending, the logs had to be rationed, and every drop of warm water was a small victory against the cold. And yet, when the moment finally arrived, it wasn't for her. First, the man of the house. He lowered himself into the steaming water with a long sigh, shoulders slumped but content. His clothes had been dusted with earth from the field, his hands blackened from work, his beard smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. But still, he got the cleanest water. That was the rule. Whether he'd worked harder or not that week didn't matter. His position did. He was the head of the household. The bath honoured that. When he was done, he stepped out slowly, leaving a grey film floating on the surface behind him. Then came the boys, one by one. Their grubby feet and scraped knees splashed into the tub, turning the cloudy water murkier with each child. They giggled, fought over space, and used their sleeves as washcloths. No one scolded them. They were being boys. She waited through all of it, quietly, often by the wall, mending a hem or stirring the evening pot. No one offered to let her go first. It simply didn't happen that way. Even the youngest daughter might get a quick rinse before her. After all, girls could still grow up and marry well. Appearances mattered more for them. By the time the house fell quiet again and the fire had died to a dull red glow, it was her turn. The tub was tepid now, the water tinted brown with the dirt of 3 or 4 bodies. Hair floated at the edges, bits of grass clung to the rim. The scent wasn't just smoke anymore. It had taken on something human, tangible, lived in. She didn't protest. There was no one to protest to. A curtain might be drawn around her, or the others might turn their backs out of habit. But there were no walls, no doors. She was visible, even in privacy. And though her body ached from chores, her hands chapped from cold water and rough cloth, the moment of cleansing wasn't comfort, it was obligation. She stepped in slowly, holding up her skirts, trying not to disturb the oily sheen on top. She didn't splash or sigh. There was no pleasure in this water, just the memory of warmth and the faint hope of feeling slightly less sticky afterward. She'd brought her own cloth, already damp from being wrung out once, and began the ritual neck, underarms, feet, in that order. She didn't soak, she didn't linger. She was last, as always, and no one remarked on it. There was no sarcasm, no jokes about being fashionably late to the bath. Just silence, a silence full of understanding and resignation. It had always been this way, and always would be, unless you were wealthy enough to bathe alone or rebellious enough to demand it, which she wasn't. The bath was never hers. It was borrowed water. She lived in a castle, yes, but don't let the stone walls fool you. It wasn't a palace of gold, nor a place of daily comfort. It was cold in winter, damp in spring, and draughty in every other season. And though there were servants, silks, and the occasional roast pig with an apple in its mouth, there was no such thing as running water, no copper pipes, no bathroom waiting behind a painted door. What passed for a bath had to be earned carried, boiled, poured, and prayed over. Every drop of cleanliness was labour. Her bath began hours before she touched the water. The maidservants, or sometimes the scullery boys, would descend the spiral stairs with buckets swinging from iron hooks. The well sat outside the castle walls, or if she was lucky, deep in the courtyard still a distance down uneven flagstones and through the chill morning fog. The buckets weren't light. They were made of oak and bound with iron rings, heavier than they looked, especially when filled, and the journey back up was a test of tendon and balance. Stumble once, and the bath was gone. There were no lifts, no pulleys, just stairs. Spiral ones, always, worn smooth by centuries of feet, narrowing as they climbed. Some steps slanted inward, some outward. All were dark, tight, and unforgiving. Servants walked sideways with the weight. If one tripped, the water splashed out, scalding their feet, soaking their skirts. Sometimes they wept quietly and went back for more. Cleanliness required silence. The water had to be heated, of course, in massive iron pots over open fires. That meant chopping wood firstward that had to be fetched, dried, stacked, and rationed. Fires didn't roar at the snap of fingers. They smoked. They resisted. They needed coaxing, just like the castle's half-frozen inhabitants. So a bath meant this hours of heavy lifting, fuel consumed, servants tired, the house smelling not of perfume but of smoke, wet wool, and boiling metal, all for one tub. The tub itself was rarely majestic. Sometimes it was made of tin, sometimes of carved wood with clawed feet and iron hoops holding it together. It wasn't large. It was barely deep enough to soak the thighs. There were no bubbles, no oils, no floral salts, just hot water, sometimes faintly herbal, if someone had thrown in mint leaves or dried lavender from the pantry. But most of the time, even in this stone castle with banners fluttering above and tapestries lining the walls, bathing didn't happen. The room was there, yes, a tiled chamber with a window high and narrow, a tub under it, maybe a brass hook for hanging robes, but it sat unused, cold, echoing, waiting. Why? Because no one wanted to carry the water up again. It wasn't that she didn't care to be clean. It wasn't vanity or laziness. It was math. Every bath cost hours of labour, armfuls of wood, and the energy of people who had other things to do: mending, cooking, scrubbing, child-watching, prayer. So she learned to economise. A full bath was reserved for feast days, for after childbirth, for moments of rare extravagance. It was never expected, not even for queens. And when it did happen, when she finally stepped into warm water poured just for her, it wasn't relaxation. It was a reward, a costly one. She would sit straight, not slouch. Someone might sponge her arms, pour water down her back, and dry her with cloths warmed by the fire. But even then, the bath was brief. She knew what it had cost to fill. She felt it in the red faces of her maids, in the scorch marks on the kitchen hearth, in the pile of firewood gone. Bathing was an act of coordination, not of leisure, and afterward the clean-up. The water had to be drained, scooped out with jugs, carried back down those same cursed stairs, and dumped outside. The tub had to be scrubbed, the cloths hung, the scent of damp stone would linger for hours. No one talked about it. No one thanked the bath for existing. They just moved on. Visitors often assumed the castle was a place of constant splendour, but the residents knew better. There were no scented candles, no marble floors warmed by invisible systems. There was only stone and air, and the slow realisation that even the rich could not buy comfort without effort. Even castles could not afford daily cleanliness. And so, between baths, she did what most women did. She wiped down with cloths. She used rose water if she had it, or boiled wine if not. She wore layers to mask scent and changed her shift more often than her gown. Her maids helped when they could, but mostly she managed herself, quietly, dignified. Cleanliness, in her world, was not guaranteed by status. It was carried, step by step, in buckets of water up a staircase designed to humble every foot that climbed it, and that perhaps more than her title or jewellery was what defined her strength. Not the way she bathed, but the fact that she kept trying, even when the water had to fight its way uphill. There was a time when cleanliness was public, not private, not shameful, not locked away behind curtains and closed shutters. It belonged to everyone: bakers, beggars, noblewomen, midwives, monks. In cities from Paris to Prague, the bathhouse stood proudly near the town square, its chimney releasing steady coils of steam, its doors swinging open to welcome the tired, the sore, the dusty. For a coin or two, you could shed your grime and, just for an hour, soak in hot water until your bones stopped aching. And people loved it. They truly did. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about rhythm. The rhythm of scrubbing your back while a neighbour hummed softly nearby, of warm stones underfoot, of steam thickening the air until all sound softened, of someone offering you rosemary oil for your scalp, of conversation drifting like vapour between strangers. For many, it was the only space in town where you could breathe deeply and feel, if only briefly, unburdened. Women especially needed it. The bathhouse gave them time away from the endless scraping of pots, the spit-stained floors, the baby on the hip, the bread that wouldn't rise, the husband who never helped. Here, among other women, they could wash, properly, not in a freezing corner of the cottage, not crouched behind a screen with a cloth and a prayer, but fully, freely. They brought their daughters, they laughed, they helped each other untangle hair, or scrub a hard-to-reach spot. For some, it was the only moment in the week when anyone touched them with gentleness. But that time didn't last. Whispers began. About the bathhouse being too warm, too mixed, too free. About the sicknesses that lingered in shared water. About what happened in the corners, in the quiet. The church frowned. Priests began warning of the dangers of nakedness, of mingling, of vanity. And then came the plague. The Black Death didn't kill the bathhouse immediately, but it loaded the bullet. Fear spread faster than fever. Anything shared became suspect. Communal tubs, steam rooms, towels. Voices began linking disease to the act of bathing itself, as if warm water opened the pores and let in death. Officials shut down bathhouses for the safety of the people. Some reopened, most didn't. And in the silence that followed, suspicion bloomed. A woman seen entering a bathhouse, alone, especially might as well have entered a brothel. Her reputation softened like soap in warm water. Men gossiped, women judged. What kind of woman, they asked, needs to be that clean, because now dirt was modesty, smell was chastity, and a clean woman, somehow, became a dirty idea. So women stayed home, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They gave up the warmth, the conversation, the rare moment of being tended to. They returned to wiping down in silence, behind kitchen doors and fire screens. The cloth grew rougher, the water colder, but they endured. In the towns, bathhouses crumbled. Some were torn down, others repurposed as warehouses, stables, or storage for grain. The tiled floors cracked, the basins dried, the painted ceilings, once echoing with laughter, flaked into dust. All that remained was rumour. Of course, not all rumours were wrong. Some bathhouses had become places of transaction body for coin, pleasure for privacy. But that wasn't the whole story. Most were simply places where the human need for warmth, for touch, for a moment of peace, was briefly answered. The tragedy wasn't that the bathhouse fell out of favour. The tragedy was that women were left without an alternative. No replacement came, no private chamber, no copper tub, just a basin and a rag, a corner and a curtain, and a long memory of a place where she had once been allowed to be clean in the company of others. She stayed home, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. That was the quiet truth. And for centuries, her silence filled the space where bathhouses used to stand. It wasn't a bath, but it was enough. Every morning, before the sun had fully warmed the shutters, she prepared her ritual. It was quiet, always quiet. The kind of silence that made the dog stay curled by the hearth. The kind that held still even the spoons in the drawer. No one needed to be woken. No one needed to know. She folded the cloth first, a square of linen worn soft from years of rinsing and wringing. It had once been a shift, perhaps, or part of a child's bed sheet. Now, it was her tool of dignity. Beside it, she placed a small basin. Sometimes it held warm water, if the fire had been kept through the night. Sometimes it was cold, poured straight from the jug. On rare mornings, she added a sprig of rosemary or mint, letting it steep until the water smelled faintly alive. And then she crouched in the corner, always the same corner, behind the old curtain that hung lopsided from a bit of bent wire. It didn't fully hide her. It wasn't meant to. It only suggested privacy, offered the illusion of solitude. She didn't disrobe. That wasn't necessary. This wasn't bathing. This was maintenance. A series of small, precise gestures, half practical, half sacred. She dipped the cloth into the basin, wrung it out carefully, and began. First the face. Wiped down the brow, under the eyes, along the jaw. Always outward, never hurried. Then the neck, then the hands, then the underarms, one at a time, always keeping her arms crossed modestly over her chest, as if even in solitude someone might be watching. Then the feet. She unlaced her shoes and rubbed the arches, the toes, the places where dirt gathered despite her best efforts. She never went further unless absolutely necessary. There were places on the body that could be wiped only in emergency after illness, after blood, after childbirth. Otherwise, those parts remained untouched, not because she didn't want to be clean, but because time, space, and rules made it impossible. There was no mirror. She had never owned one. She had no need to see her face to know what she looked like. Her hands knew. Her cloth knew. The tug of skin, the roughness near the elbow, the way the rag dragged a little heavier across her cheeks in winter. That was how she measured herself. She didn't smell like roses, but she didn't smell like rot either. And that, in her world, counted as success. The cloth was rinsed after each use, hung over the back of a chair or near the fire to dry. It smelled faintly of ash and vinegar. It frayed at the edges. When it became too thin, it was folded and sewn into smaller cloths for the baby, for the floor, for the chamber pot. The basin, too, had its place. It was never used for anything else. It lived near the hearth, behind the larger pots. Children were taught not to touch it, not because it was fragile, but because it was hers, her one small claim in a house full of need. This daily wiping was not a luxury, it was a strategy, a way to stay ahead of odour, of discomfort, of judgment. A woman who smelled bad might be mocked, a woman who smelled too good might be questioned. So she walked the line presentable, invisible, correct. It took less than 10 minutes, but it framed her day. It was how she reminded herself that her body still belonged to her, that it wasn't just for service, for cooking, for children, for tending to others. It was hers, even if only in this one small act, each morning, behind a curtain. In the summer, she wiped again before bed, dust from the fields, sweat from cooking, smudges of flour and soot. The cloth worked hard, and so did she. But at night, After everyone else had closed their eyes, she returned to her basin, dipped her cloth, and cleaned the day off her skin. It didn't make her sparkle. It didn't undo the roughness of labour, but it offered a moment of stillness, a breath, a pause before sleep. In other homes, other women did the same. In corners, behind doors, between the folds of daily life. No one talked about it. No one needed to. It was the shared choreography of survival. A dance passed down from mother to daughter, not with words, but with habits. A basin, a cloth, a shadow of privacy. This was not cleanliness as we know it. It was not indulgent. It was not fragrant or soft-lit. It was cloth soaked in water, wrung by hand, used with care. It was the body kept in check, not celebrated. And yet, behind that curtain, she was sovereign. For those 10 minutes, no one asked anything of her. No one watched. No one judged. It was hers. No sermon was preached. No record kept. But this was ritual. A quiet, wet square of linen. A bowl of water. A woman. A moment. That was all. And that was everything. The fire was nothing more than embers now soft and red. Like the last breath of a day that had asked too much of her. But still, she leaned in close and fed it one more twig. Not a full log that was for cooking. Just enough wood to coax a small pot of water into warmth. That was all she needed. She'd gathered those twigs earlier, while pretending to look for herbs. Along the edge of the road where the horses passed, where no one watched too closely, she pocketed what others ignored: cracked branches, strips of bark, wind-snapped kindling too small for the stove but just right for this. Each twig was a protest. Each leaf of dry rosemary, a decision. She didn't ask permission. The pot wasn't large. It had dents from years of use and a blackened bottom that no amount of scrubbing could redeem. She filled it halfway, careful not to splash. Eating too much would be wasteful. Eating just enough was wisdom. She didn't speak while it warmed. No one did during this ritual. Even her children had learned to tiptoe when they saw the basin out. The cloth folded neatly nearby, the fire low but intentional. It was her moment, not in the romantic sense. Not something offered, but something she carved out with persistence. A right seized, not given. When the water began to steam, she reached for the bundle she kept hidden in a pouch behind the hearth. A few dried lavender blossoms, a pinch of rosemary, crushed mint if she had it. Not much. Not enough to impress a visitor or scent a room. Just enough to rise with the heat and remind her that she, too, could smell sweet if only faintly, if only for a few hours. She poured the water into the basin slowly, reverently, as if not to wake the walls. The steam curled upward, kissing her face, softening the lines at the corners of her mouth that no one ever complimented. She dipped the cloth, now clean and warm in her hands, and began to wipe. It wasn't like other mornings. The cold water wipe was efficient, bracing, designed for control, but warm water lingered. It gave her permission to slow down, to feel. She wiped her face first, and not just quickly. She paused at her temples, traced her jawline with the soft edge of a linen, then her neck, warm and pliant, like a piece of bread just out of the oven, her collarbones, the backs of her hands, the bend of her elbows. She didn't rush. This wasn't hygiene. This wasn't survival. This was something else. A statement. No one outside would see the difference. Her dress was the same. Her hair, still tucked beneath a kerchief. But she knew. Her skin had been tended to. Her muscles had softened. Her scent, faint but purposeful, clung to the hollow behind her ears. And that meant something. Because in a world where time, water, firewood, and privacy were all controlled by someone else, warmth was a kind of rebellion. It said, I may not own this house, but I own this body. It said, I may serve others, but I serve myself first tonight. At least, it said, I refuse to disappear. She folded the cloth carefully after, not tossed, not crumpled. Each corner met with precision. She laid it over the back of a chair near the fire, where it would dry into a soft stiffness by morning. The basin she wiped with a second rag and covered with a lid. The leftover water, still scented, was poured at the base of the rosebush outside. Even waste deserved ceremony. She never spoke of these moments, not to her husband, who wouldn't have understood, not to her children, who might mock her one day when they were too tired to imagine warmth as anything but a luxury, not to the neighbour, who might mistake it for pride, but it was pride, a quiet, sharp-edged kind, the kind that refused to disappear into sweat and dirt, the kind that remembered through everything that she was still a woman, still flesh, still spirit, still worthy of something more than the bare minimum. Sometimes, when she sat back down by the fire and combed her hair, still slightly damp from the heat in the room, she would catch a whiff of lavender. It never lasted long. The smoke from the chimney overwhelmed it quickly. The stew, the children, the unwashed linen hanging by the door. But for that brief window of time, she carried a scent that belonged only to her. No one else noticed, but she did. It was not indulgence, it was defiance. A clean face was not a luxury, it was armour. A basin of warm water was not a favour, it was an achievement. And that little folded cloth, drying beside the fire that was her flag, raised quietly in a world that preferred her invisible. And though the world may not have noticed her victory, it didn't matter. She did. She never saw herself clearly. There were no mirrors in the house, none that weren't cloudy or cracked. Anyway, nothing that gave a full reflection, only warped pieces of polished metal, good for glimpsing a smudge on the cheek or checking the angle of a hairpin. Nothing more. Vanity was a sin, they said, and glass, real glass, was too expensive to waste on faces that weren't meant to be admired. So she learned with her hands. Clean wasn't something she saw, it was something she felt. The ridge of a dry elbow and the softened curve of skin after wiping, the tacky layer of sweat beneath a braid. Her fingers became her mirror quiet, patient, intimate. Each night, after the children had gone quiet and the bread was covered with a cloth to cool, she reached for the flannels. They lived in the firebox, not in the fire itself, but in the small wooden drawer built beside it. Warm, dry, always waiting. Linen squares, reused and rewashed more times than she could count. Some had been dresses. Some were pieces of her mother's apron. One had once belonged to a child now grown. She pulled one out, rubbed it between her fingers, still soft, still faithful, no rush, no need to speak. She dipped it in a bit of water if there was any left from the evening's pot, not to soak just enough to dampen the edges. Then she began. She wiped behind her ears, across the back of her neck, down her arms, over wrists. She didn't bother with perfume. There was none. Only the faint scent of dried herbs stored in the linen chest, a hint of hay, the ghost of vinegar, the sharpness of thyme. If she was lucky, the cloth smelled faintly of smoke and clean cotton scents that meant work had been done and rest was earned. She didn't aim for fragrance. She aimed for balance. Not too ripe, not too polished, just enough to blend into the air. That was the goal. When she wiped her underarms, she did it slowly, pressing the cloth flat against her skin, then lifting it, folding it over, and wiping again. No deodorant, no powders, just touch, just fabric, just her own quiet judgment about whether she could bear herself for another day. Sometimes, after wiping, she'd cup her hand to her skin and inhale, not out of shame, out of calculation. Did she need to rinse the cloth? Could it wait another day? Was that trace of sweat still within bounds? Or would someone wrinkle their nose at the market? She made the decision. No one else. The flannel, once used, was folded again, never crumpled. She pressed the creases gently, smoothing it flat with her palm. Then she placed it back in the firebox to dry overnight in the gentle heat radiating from the stones. No one else touched them. The children knew. That drawer belonged to her. It wasn't labelled. It didn't need to be. In the mornings, the cloths were warm when she returned to them. Not hot, but comfort warm like bread left too close to the hearth. They smelled like stone and air and clean skin. She smiled, faintly. Each time she opened that drawer, it was one of the few things in the house she controlled entirely. There was no rush to replace them, no factory sending more. Each cloth had to last. When one tore or thinned, she cut it smaller, rehemmed the edge, and used it for smaller tasks, wiping the face, the hands, the insides of shoes. The life of the cloth was never over. It simply changed purpose. She used the same system her mother had used, and her mother before her, They didn't call it self-care. There was no name for it, just something you did, so you wouldn't feel sticky, or smell strange, or lose track of your own edges. It gave her space, even if only inside her mind, because for those few minutes, cloth in hand, eyes closed, skin damp and tingling, she belonged to no one. Not the baby, not the man asleep on the mat, not the stew cooling in the corner. She wasn't a mother. She wasn't a wife. She was simply herself. And in that moment, all she needed was a flannel, the firebox, and the memory of her own skin. She never needed a mirror. She didn't need to see herself to know she still existed. Maybe the well had frozen overnight, or the rain barrel had dried up before the last laundry. Maybe the firewood had all gone to the stew pot, or maybe she simply didn't have the strength to haul another bucket up the hill. Whatever the reason, the basin stayed empty, and still, she had to clean herself, because her body doesn't wait. So she reached for the second option. Not ideal, not pleasant, but necessary. The dry wipe. It wasn't taught as a formal skill. There were no instructions. You learned by watching older women, by doing, by improvising with what you had. The tools were simple: a bit of coarse cloth, a pinch of flour, and a quiet corner where no one would ask questions. Flour was always nearby, not the fine, bleached kind we know now. It was rough, slightly grey, with specks of husk still in it, ground coarse from barley or rye. If she was lucky, wheat. It was for bread. Yes, but also for sweat. She dipped her fingers into the sack and took just enough to fill her palm. Not more. Wasting flour was a sin in any household, and women were watched more closely than anyone when it came to that. She rubbed it under each arm, gently but firmly. The flour stuck to the skin, absorbing whatever oils had built up during the day. It clung to damp patches, drew out the scent of labour. Then, with a different clothone of the flannels that had already seen better days, she brushed it off. That was it. That was the wipe. No water, no soap, just powder and pressure. She didn't feel clean, not exactly, but she felt neutral, dry, bearable, not refreshing, just controlled. Sometimes, when flour felt too wasteful, she used crushed herbs instead. Rosemary dried well and was often tucked in the rafters to keep insects away. Mint, if she could find it. Even chalk dust, if she had scraped some from the edges of the walls. Anything to absorb, anything to hide. These powders weren't fragrant, but they helped mask what mustn't be spoken. There were no deodorants, no perfumes, only dry leaves, ground fine, patted gently into the creases of the body, then dusted away like a secret. She applied the same method to her chest, her feet, the backs of her knees. No full-body ritual, there was no time, no privacy. Just the worst parts, the parts that made others wrinkle their nose, the parts that made her feel like she was disappearing into her own sweat. And when she was done, she folded the cloth carefully and shook the flour out the back door, never in front, never where someone might see a cloud of white rise and guess what it meant. There was shame in need, but there was also defiance in knowing how to hide it. The dry wipe was born from scarcity, but it offered a sliver of control. In the summer, it helped prevent rashes. The body, stuck under too many layers of cloth, needed relief wherever it could find it. And in winter, when washing with cold water felt like punishment, the dry wipe kept her skin from cracking, her underarms from itching, her mind from unravelling. The first time a girl learned it, she usually laughed. It felt absurd, rubbing flour into her own skin like a pastry. But over time, the absurdity wore off. What remained was understanding. This was not a substitute. It was a strategy. She didn't expect to feel renewed afterward. She didn't imagine the way people now imagine eucalyptus showers or soap that smells like ocean air. She only hoped to keep her scent from turning sharp, to avoid the moment when someone leaned in and recoiled. That was enough. Sometimes. She watched her own daughter mimic her motions, dabbing, brushing, folding the same cloth. It felt like passing on a spell, one that didn't promise beauty, but survival. Even the cloths used for dry wiping were different. They were thinner, older, scratchier. Good towels were saved for real water days. These were the ones you didn't mind staining, the ones you could boil later, or even burn if you had to. There were rules, quiet ones. Never wipe with the same cloth 2 days in a row, never wipe in front of anyone, never speak about what you're doing, And never, ever ask for more flour than you need. Her husband once asked why they were running out of grain faster than usual. She shrugged and blamed the rats. He nodded and moved on. He never noticed how smooth her skin was under the arms. Never asked how, without bathing. She managed to not offend, because he didn't think about that. He assumed it just happened, that women were naturally clean, naturally soft, naturally free of smell. They were simply good at hiding it. The dry wipe wasn't glamorous, didn't change her life, but it allowed her to move through tone-silent, powdered gesture at a time. She used it when water was scarce, when time was stolen, when dignity had to be assembled from scraps of wheat and silence. She used it because she couldn't do nothing, and so, in the cold of the morning or the stillness of night, she stood with a cloth in one hand and flour in the other, performing a ritual no one taught her, for a cleanliness no one would ever praise. But it worked, and sometimes that was enough. She never called it self-care. There were no scented candles, no rituals labelled with foreign words, no curated playlists humming in the background. There was only the rhythm of the day, carved into silence, wrapped in routine, but still it was care, quiet, consistent, and hers alone. Each morning began before the others stirred. She moved like water through the house barefoot, practiced, gentle. The floorboards didn't creak beneath her because they knew her steps. She knew exactly where not to step. In the grey light of dawn, before the rooster had cleared its throat, she dipped her cloth into the watershed left by the hearth the night before. Cold now, but not frozen. She squeezed it tight and pressed it to her cheeks. No splashing, no dramatic gasp, just a firm wipe, from eyes to chin, tracing the curve of her face like someone cleaning a beloved plate. She wiped her eyelids, the corners of her mouth, the crease beneath her neck. Then she folded the cloth, turned it over, and did it again. A second pass not for cleanliness, but for acknowledgement. She existed. She was here. She changed her shift next. The linen layer that hugged her skin all day soaked up the sweat, the smoke, the fatigue of labour. It was never glamorous, stained, patched, carefully mended at the seams, but fresh, always fresh. She pulled on the new one with practised hands, smoothing it down over her hips as if pressing away yesterday's burdens. There was no applause for these tasks, no husband sitting up in bed to murmur praise, no child watching in admiration. She didn't want that. She didn't need it. It would have made the act heavier, more performative. No one noticed that she wiped her face before the sun rose, but she did, and that was enough. In the evenings, it was the same, different motions, same quiet care. After the pots were scrubbed and the floor swept, after the fire was reduced to a flickering orange whisper, she returned to herself, not loudly, not ceremoniously, just gently. She sat on the low stool by the wall, the one with the uneven leg, and untied the kerchief from her head. Her hair spilled out, not glossy or styled, just hair, thick, familiar, stubborn. She divided it into sections and began to brush. 1 stroke, 2, 3, not hurried, not indulgent. Each stroke pulled away the day, bits of ash from the oven, flour from kneading, the scent of potatoes and onions clinging to her scalp. The comb tugged but didn't complain. Her arms ached but didn't stop. This was her moment of stillness, her proof that she still belonged to herself. Afterward, she dipped her feet into a shallow basin of water warmed from the fire's edge. Not hot warm enough to loosen the tightness from walking, to soften the skin cracked by winter's edge. She ran a cloth between her toes, over her heels, then dried them with the same linen used that morning, now almost dry again. Her feet never looked delicate. They bore years of standing, chasing, fetching, but they were cared for, and that made them beautiful to her. She didn't speak during these moments. If someone walked in, she nodded, waited, continued. The silence was the ritual. It wrapped her like a shawl, soft, protective. It didn't matter if she had cried the night before, if the stew had burned, if the baby had fussed all day. These gestures remained, anchors in the storm. No one told her to do them. No one asked why. She just did. Not out of vanity, out of survival. Because if she didn't wipe her face, who would if she didn't untangle her hair, clean her feet, Change her shift what would be left of her. It was the small things, done daily, that built a woman from the inside out. She remembered watching her mother do the same, not talking, just working her own hair with a wooden comb, wrapping her flannels by the hearth, whispering to herself as she folded her night shift. The words didn't matter. The motion did. Now, years later, she carried on the same tradition, a choreography of care no one clapped for, and someday, her daughter would learn the same. That self-care didn't need an audience, it didn't need permission, it only needed a basin, a cloth, a few minutes before sleep. No one ever complimented her skin. No one noticed that her hair rarely tangled, that her feet, though tired, never split. She didn't expect them to. No one praised the sun for rising each day, but still it did, and in the same way, she rose for herself, every morning, every night. No one clapped, no one commented, but she did it anyway, because love doesn't always speak. Sometimes, it just folds the towel in half and begins again. She didn't remember the first time her mother handed her the cloth. Not exactly. There was no ceremony, no candlelight, no whispered wisdom passed from one generation to the next. Just a simple motion, familiar, unconscious, inevitable. Her mother reached for the basin, dipped the rag, wrung it out, and then paused, handed it over, let her hold it. It was damp and warm, not heavy, but it felt like a responsibility. The cloth had been folded twice, once for hygiene, once for modesty. Its edges were frayed, its centre stained pale from hundreds of washes. It smelled faintly of smoke, lavender and vinegar. It was not new, it was not beautiful, but it was clean. She remembered holding it, unsure of what to do, and her mother didn't say anything, or she didn't correct her grip or recite instructions. She simply turned away, gave her space, and let her try. That was the lesson. No words, no map, just repetition. Each morning, she watched. The rhythm never changed, the water heated just enough to steam. The cloth folded once and again, the wiping starting at the forehead and ending at the fingertips. Her mother never looked in a mirror. She looked inward, felt her way, measured progress by the feel of skin beneath linen. Some days, the water was too cold. On others, there wasn't enough. Once, in winter, the cloth froze stiff, and her mother warmed it between her palms before wiping her own face. She never complained. She never explained. That, too, was part of the ritual. By the time she was old enough to copy the movements alone, no one congratulated her. No one said, "Well done." They just expected it. She could now carry the cloth, heat the water, know which herbs to crush for scent and which stains meant the cloth should be boiled instead of rinsed. It became muscle memory, part of the background of her life. And yet, every time she folded the cloth for drying, she remembered her mother's hands, not her face, not even her voice, but her hands. The way they gripped the corners, the way they patted it flat on the table after use, the quiet finality of that motion. That cloth, of course, did not last forever, but others followed. Cut from worn garments, hemmed by hand, stored in the same place behind the hearth, or in a small box that smelled of time and dust. Each cloth was like a page in a book she had never been taught to read but could somehow understand. Years later, when she had daughters of her own, she found herself doing the same thing. No instructions, no lectures, just a moment. Here is the cloth. You are old enough. You are ready. She didn't say the words. She didn't have to. The cloth made the statement for her. At first, her daughter fumbled, spilled water, dried it with the wrong rag, wiped too harshly or forgot to clean behind her ears, but she learned. Not because she was corrected, but because she observed. Every act of wiping was a lesson. Every mistake, a note quietly rewritten. There were no manuals for women in her world. No printed charts telling girls how to bathe, when to change shifts, how to wash blood from fabric without leaving a stain. There were only cloths, passed down, reused, reinvented. They held secrets, not dramatic ones, no treasure maps or codes, just knowledge. How to fold to avoid wrinkles, how to dry near the fire without burning, how to check the temperature of the water with the inside of the wrist, not the finger, how to rub gently in circles when cleaning the chest, and always end by rinsing the cloth in clean water before setting it down. She came to love those secrets, not because they made her extraordinary, but because they reminded her she came from something, a lineage of women who didn't need instructions to survive. One day, she noticed that her youngest daughter had started wiping before being told. She had taken the flannel out on her own, filled the basin with the morning's cold water, and crouched in the corner by the window, dabbing at her cheeks. She didn't do it perfectly, but she did it, and no one said a word. That was how it worked. One day, she would do it alone, and no one would say anything. No applause, no affirmations, just quiet knowing. The cloth passes hand to hand, warm, damp, folded, an inheritance without gold, a tradition without ceremony, but one that keeps the body intact, and the memory of women alive. She could go weeks without washing her hair, and no one thought it strange. In fact, they praised her for it quietly, with approving nods, or simply by not commenting at all, because in her world, a dry scalp wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a sign of wisdom. Everyone knew wet hair meant danger. It wasn't just superstition, it was experience. The cold crept in fast, especially in stone houses with no insulation, no chimney draft that worked properly. Once your hair was wet, it stayed wet. Not for minutes, not for hours, but sometimes for days. Long, thick hair turned into a sponge, holding onto water, dripping down the back of your shift, soaking the collar, chilling your bones. And if you caught the cold from that well, there were no pills, no doctor with soft hands and clean white gloves. There was only bed rest, maybe a bit of vinegar, and a prayer that your lungs wouldn't seize. So she kept her hair dry, almost always. It wasn't out of laziness. Washing her hair, when she finally did it, was a full-day endeavour. It began with boiling water, several pots of it. That meant collecting firewood, stoking the hearth, guarding the flames. Then came the hauling pails to the basin, careful not to spill, careful not to burn. No one helped her. It wasn't a communal affair. It was a private burden. Next came the combing. You couldn't wash tangled hair, it turned into rope. So she sat near the fire and worked through it slowly with a wooden comb, teeth wide and worn smooth. Sometimes she added a little oil, if she had any, just to soften the strands. Sometimes she didn't. Once, detangled, she knelt beside the basin and poured warm water over her scalp, wincing as it ran down her neck. There was no shampoo, only vinegar, usually apple cider, thinned with water to break the grease. If she had dried flowers, she might crush them into a past lavender, chamomile, maybe even nettle leaves, if she was feeling bold. Not for beauty, for function, anything to keep the scalp clean and discourage lice. She scrubbed the roots with her fingertips. Fingernails weren't fashionable, they were tools. She scratched gently behind the ears, massaged the crown, rinsed again. Her arms ached by the end of it, but there was no time to rest, because then came drying. She had no towel, only linen cloths, already in use for wiping the body, the floor, the children. She used them anyway, blotted the hair in sections, squeezed out what she could. The rest had to dry naturally. That meant hours by the hearth, flipping her braid from shoulder to shoulder, feeling steam rise from the ends. She couldn't sleep with wet hair. That was asking for fever. So she waited. Sometimes she had to explain why she couldn't help with supper, or why she was sitting so still for so long. She never said, because I'm trying not to get sick. She just nodded, smiled, and kept drying. Most of the time, though, she avoided the whole ordeal. She brushed instead, every evening. She took down her hair and combed it slowly. 100 strokes was a myth she counted by feel. When the comb stopped snagging, when the scalp tingled, when the strands fell straight and heavy down her back, she knew it was enough. She didn't do it to look good. She did it to stay sane. Brushing kept her head clean dislodged dust, removed loose hairs, smoothed out oil. It distributed the natural sheen that kept her braid from turning brittle. More importantly, it kept lice away, or at least tried to. When she brushed, she wasn't just maintaining hair. She was maintaining control over a small part of herself in a life that demanded so much. This was something she could shape, smooth, tame. She wore a cap during the day, a scarf if she went out. These weren't fashion. They were armour, fabric between her hair and the world, dust, ash, sweat kept at bay by a strip of linen tied tight, Her hair stayed clean longer that way. She could go 2 weeks, sometimes 3, without needing to wash. More than that, even in winter, some women cut their hair short to make it easier. She didn't. Long hair was expected. It showed that she was healthy, fertile, presentable, even if no one ever saw it unbound. It mattered, because if a woman had time to care for her hair, it meant her household was in order, her children fed, her linen washed, her floor swept. Dry hair was not just health, it was proof, and so she wore it like a badge-braided, oiled, wrapped. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone was asleep, she'd untie it and let it fall loose. The weight of it on her back reminded her she was real, that she wasn't just elbows and duty, that she had mass, presence, shape. Then she would braid it again, not tightly, just enough, and return to her quiet rituals. She didn't need anyone to tell her she looked beautiful. That wasn't the point. A dry scalp meant a healthy body, and that, in her world, was enough. It didn't smell good. Let's get that out of the way. There was nothing floral, nothing fruity, nothing that made you want to tilt your head back and breathe deep like a shampoo commercial. No silky lather, no citrus sparkle, just vinegar, sharp, sour, stinging if it got too close to the eyes. That was the reality of medieval hair care, and for most women it was more punishment than pleasure. But it worked, sort of. She started with a bowl usually the same one she used to wash her face, her arms, and sometimes her baby's feet, multi-purpose. Nothing was ever just for hair. She poured in water first, hot if she had enough fire left, and then added a small cup of apple cider vinegar. Not store-bought, of course. Homemade, cloudy, tangy, a little threatening. If she was feeling indulgent or trying to impress a neighbour, she might crush a few dried flower petals into it. Lavender, if she had it. Sometimes chamomile, occasionally sage. They didn't mask the vinegar. Nothing could. But they made her feel like she was doing more than scrubbing away grease and lice. They made it feel intentional, like care. She dipped a rag into the mixture and began rubbing it into her scalp. There was no shampoo and repeat, just one shot. No one had time for luxury loops. The cloth scratched slightly against her skin, lifting oil, breaking up the layers of dust and sweat that had settled into her roots, like guests overstaying their welcome. Sometimes, she could feel the vinegar working tiny tingles like her paws reacting to the acidity. Other times, she just felt cold. It wasn't a full hair wash. That would require too much water, too much time, and too much bravery. This was a spot treatment, a compromise, a negotiation with her own head. After scrubbing, she'd pour the rest of the vinegar water slowly over her crown, tilting forward so it didn't trickle into her eyes. It ran down the length of her hair, slicking it into thin strands, leaving behind a trail of apple-scented sharpness and a faint sting on any tiny scratches she didn't know she had. She winced, but said nothing. There was no audience, no applause. Then came the drying. She had no towels, only old linen or burlap cloths, rough enough to scrub floors. But she used them anyway, wrapped them around her hair, blotted gently, tried not to rip out too many strands. The smell of vinegar stuck to her hands for hours afterward. The steam rose like ghosts around her shoulders, and still she pressed on, because once the scalp was clean, the second phase began shine. Shiny hair, in her time, meant health. It didn't need to be styled, curled, or fragrant, just not dull, just not lifeless. So she reached for her second beauty product, animal fat. Yes, fat, not rendered into a lotion, not mixed with beeswax or perfume, just pure lard or tallow goose, if she could get it. Stored in a jar in the back of the pantry, it served multiple purposes: lamp fuel, balm for cracked heels, polish for boots and hair conditioner. She took a dab no more than a fingernail and warmed it between her palms. It melted quickly, slick and translucent, with a faint smell of something that used to breathe. She rubbed it between her fingers, then ran them through the ends of her hair. Not near the scalp, that would be too much. Just the tips, the parts that split easily, the parts that frayed like old rope. The fat gave it weight, gave it gloss, made it look like she cared, even if the only one who would ever see it was the back of her own reflection in a pot lid. It was absurd, sometimes. She knew that. The vinegar, the fat, the way her hands smelled like salad dressing for hours after. But it was also the only moment in the week that was truly hers. She kept her comb in a pouch under the bed, wrapped in linen. It wasn't fine. Just carved wood, teeth spaced wide, one of them chipped. But it had been hers for years. Longer than her last pair of shoes, longer than the mattress. She cleaned it with the corner of her apron. She didn't let others touch it. Luxury, in her world, wasn't a gold ring or a velvet dress. Luxury was a comb and 10 minutes of peace. She didn't get those 10 minutes often. Sometimes the baby cried. Sometimes the fire died too early. Sometimes there was no vinegar, no hot water, no privacy. But when she got them, those rare moments when everything lined up, she let herself feel beautiful. Not pretty, necessarily. Not young. Just clean, tended, balanced. Her hair smelled like a kitchen, but it didn't itch. It didn't reek of mildew. It lay flat. It obeyed. She would braid it after, tight, even, or coil it into a bun beneath her scarf. No one saw it. That wasn't the point. The point was the ritual, the decision to care, even when the world told her it wasn't worth it. And on some days, when she walked through the village and caught the scent of another woman-faint vinegar, rosemary, something pungent but familiar, to feel a kind of solidarity, a silent nod between strangers. I see you. I know what you did this morning. I did it too. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't ease. But it was hers, and that meant something. She covered her hair every single day, not because she was ashamed of it, not because it was ugly or unclean, but because in her world, exposed hair was vulnerability. So she tucked it away, each morning, before the hearth had fully stirred to life and the children began to rustle on their straw beds. She sat in front of the cold wall and reached for the same piece of fabric she had folded the night before her head covering. Sometimes it was a linen scarf, stiff and plain. Other times, if it was Sunday or a feast day, she chose the softer veil, lightly yellowed at the edges, trimmed with a line of modest embroidery, a gift from her mother, who had worn it in the same way, at the same time of day, decades earlier. She didn't think of it as fashion. It was more like armour. She began by combing her hair only briefly, just enough to smooth it down. No time for vanity, only control. Then came the braid, tight and efficient, coiled against the base of her neck like a rope ready for labour. She secured it with a strip of cloth, then layered the head covering on top, folding and tucking with practised fingers. No mirror, no help, only memory and touch. The cloth framed her face like the last edge of privacy she had left. Once it was in place, she was ready to be seen. Hair, after all, wasn't meant to be public. Not for a wife. Not for a mother. Not even for a girl past her first bleed. Letting it loose. Letting it fall. Those were gestures of childhood, or of recklessness. Women in the marketplace wore their hair bound. Women in church veiled themselves. Women who let their hair down in public invited assumptions. Dangerous ones. So she kept hers hidden, out of necessity, out of habit, out of the quiet knowledge that clean didn't always mean washed, it meant invisible. Because washing wasn't always possible. In winter, the water froze in the jug before dawn. In summer, the dust clung to her sweat like a second skin. And on most days, there was simply no time, no water, no privacy. The ritual of washing, vinegar, cloths, combs required more than she had. But covering she could do. A scarf didn't ask for fuel or buckets. It didn't require warmth. It only needed intention. So she made it beautiful in her own way, chose colours that reminded her of fields, or of bread crust, or of the deep blue sky at dusk. Folded the corners with the care of a seamstress, even if no one would notice. Sometimes she tucked a sprig of dried lavender behind her ear beneath the cloth knot to be seen, but to carry a little scent of softness through the day. The scarf kept the smoke out of her hair while she cooked. It kept the ash away when she cleaned the hearth. It protected her from sweat, from wind, from strangers' eyes, and perhaps most importantly it bought her time. A clean braid might last a week if kept covered. 2 weeks if she was lucky. With the head wrap she could go longer without washing. No one questioned her. No one noticed the smell of vinegar starting to fade. The cloth did its job. She did hers, but it wasn't just about hiding dirt. It was about containing the self, keeping what was hers inside, private, safe. Even among women, she kept it covered. Bathing day, maybe not. Maybe when someone was sick and needed help combing out lice. But even then, quietly, respectfully, without comment. One did not speak of hair directly. You helped brush it, and then you moved on. Her daughters watched her, learned from her hands, not her words. They asked once why she always tied it so tightly. She didn't answer right away, just handed them the cloth and said, "You'll know when you're older," and they did. One day, they reached for their own scarves, not playfully, not pretending, but with a solemnity that surprised even them. And she saw it, the braid tucked neatly. The veil adjusted just so, and she knew they were women now, and women covered what they couldn't always care for, because hiding it was how you preserved it. She thought of queens sometimes, those in tapestries, their hair flowing like rivers, untamed, uncovered, shining in candlelight, and she wondered, did their hair really stay clean? Did they have servants to dry it, oil to scent it, time to wash it with wine? Maybe. But even queens, she knew, often wore veils, because hair, especially a woman's, was never just hair. It was read like a letter, interpreted like scripture. Loose meant wild, unbound meant wanton, dirty meant disgrace. So she chose clarity. She wrapped it, bound it, made it hers. Sometimes, when the day ended and the house had quieted, she would untie the scarf and shake her hair loose just before sleep. Let it fall over her shoulders. Let it breathe. Not for long, just a few minutes. Just enough to remember that beneath the cloth she was still whole. She would run her fingers through it, feeling the weight of the day leave strand by strand, then braid it loosely again, tuck it beneath the nightcloth, and lie down beside her husband, who rarely noticed the difference. But that wasn't the point. The point was never to be seen. The point was to know that beneath all the layers, she still had something untouched, something protected, something hers. And in a life filled with noise and obligation and judgment, that quiet act of covering, of choosing who got to see her, wasn't submission. It was power, soft, folded, pinned behind the ear, but power nonetheless. She never called it by name. It came every month, or thereabouts, not with ceremony, but with a dull ache deep in the lower belly, a warning, then a slow, dark confirmation. She felt it bloom quietly beneath her shift as she carried firewood, stirred porridge, or knelt in the garden. There was no announcement, just the sudden shift in how she moved, slightly slower, more careful, guarding her body like a secret. There were no sanitary pads, no cotton tampons wrapped in plastic, no medicine to dull the pain or sterilised instructions printed in neat little leaflets. There was just cloth, old cloth, worn, washed, reused, often cut from ruined aprons, shredded petticoats, baby linens no longer soft enough for skin. She folded it, thick and precise, into rectangles she could tuck between her legs. Some women rolled theirs like bundles of herbs. Others layered them into rough makeshift pads held in place by the friction of thighs and the tightness of undergarments, if they wore any. She had no underwear in the way modern women might imagine, just layers of skirts, sometimes trousers sewn from linen, and a keen awareness of how to hold herself still. On bad days, she tied a strip of fabric between her legs to anchor the cloth. On worse days, she didn't move much at all. The blood wasn't the problem, she wasn't afraid of it. She'd seen plenty, from lambs, from childbirth, from cuts and scrapes and women miscarrying quietly behind barns. Blood wasn't shameful, but being seen bleeding, that was different. So she hid it. If a stain leaked through, she didn't gasp. She didn't draw attention. She would slip quietly into the shadows, refold her cloth, adjust her skirts, and carry on. Maybe she'd sit on straw instead of a bench. Maybe she'd pretend she spilled broth on her lap. Anything but admit the truth. There were rules. Some spoken, most not. Don't hang the cloth where it might be seen. Don't wash it at the communal well. Don't let the boys catch you carrying the blood-stained rags to the fire to boil. If they did, they'd laugh, or worse, whisper. Some households had stricter rules. A menstruating woman wasn't allowed to knead bread or touch fresh milk. Some claimed it spoiled, others claimed it was unclean. Once, a cousin was sent to sleep in the grain shed during her cycle, her mother slipping her food like she was diseased. She remembered that night, the cousin crying softly through the wooden walls, not from pain, from being cast out for being normal. So she learned to be quiet, to clean the cloth at night, wringing it in cold water with vinegar or ash, hanging it behind the hearth or drying it between layers of other laundry so no one noticed. When the cloth became stiff or too worn, she cut it down into rags for wiping mud from boots. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was displayed either. The smell of menstrual blood wasn't overpowering. Not to her. She knew its iron tang, its sourness when left too long, but it was familiar. What mattered was whether others could detect it. That was the fear. So she layered her scent with crushed mint leaves, rubbed rosemary oil behind her ears, kept bundles of dried thyme sewn into her bodice. If someone remarked on the smell, she smiled and said it was for her nerves. And yes, there was pain. It came in waves, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp, blooming under her ribs and curling into her thighs. She didn't cry. Crying didn't help. She curled around a warm stone if one was available, tucked into bed only if she could afford the time. She never mentioned it aloud. There was no word for cramps in her vocabulary, no way to describe the hollow pulling inside her, so she grit her teeth and moved slower. If the pain became too much, she chewed dried yarrow or crushed raspberry leaves into her tea. Whether they worked or not, she couldn't say, but they gave her something to do, a way to feel like she was participating in her own survival. She never once told her husband when she bled. He might have noticed when she declined his touch, when she sat with her knees together and her eyes half-lidded, but he never asked. And she never offered the truth. It wasn't shame, not exactly, but it was protection. If he knew, he might expect her to rest, or worse, resent her for it, or worse still, ignore her discomfort entirely, so silence became safety. When her daughters bled for the first time, they came to her wide-eyed and frightened, clutching the cloth like a question. She didn't cry or scold. She just folded the fabric and showed them how to wash, how to wrap, how to breathe through the cramping, how to keep moving, even when the world asked for stillness. She taught them where to hang the cloth so it would dry quickly but be out of sight. She showed them which herbs smelled strongest, which stains came out with ash, and which ones never truly vanished. And when they asked, "Why don't we tell anyone?" she paused. Then she said, "Because no one will make space for it, so we make our own." The menstrual cloth wasn't just fabric. It was a map passed down from woman to woman, tracing a route through a world that refused to acknowledge what their bodies did naturally. Each fold, each rinse, each subtle adjustment was a mark of lineage, a quiet inheritance. She remembered once, on a particularly bad month, when the pain made her legs tremble and the cloth refused to stay in place. She sat behind the henhouse, out of sight, trying not to sob. Her youngest found her there, holding a fresh bundle of rags. She didn't say a word, just handed them over and sat down nearby, pretending to look for eggs. That was the moment she knew her daughter had become a woman, not when she bled, but when she learned not to flinch from another woman's blood. And even in that silence there was love. There was always silence, but it wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was gentleness in disguise. Sometimes it was the only shield they had. Menstruation was not shameful, but silence was safer. So she stitched that silence into every layer of her cloth, into every herbal bundle, into every pause at the hearth when someone passed too closely. And when the bleeding stopped, when her body no longer gave that monthly ache, when the cloth stayed folded for months untouched, she didn't celebrate. She just folded the fabric one last time and tucked it into the bottom of her chest, not because she needed it, but because someone would, and she would be there to show them how. She never hung them in daylight. That was the first rule. The cloths, those folded squares of linen streaked with old blood and soaked in vinegar, were never to be seen. Not by men, not by children, not by guests. They weren't dirty, they weren't shameful, but they were private, and in her world, privacy was fragile, so she washed them at night. After supper was done and the dishes dried, after the youngest was asleep and the fire had dimmed to a red glow, she fetched the bucket. It was never the main basin. That one was too visible, too public. She used a smaller one, chipped and dented, kept beneath the cot in the corner, into it. She poured water she had saved from cooking cloudy, but warm. She stirred in a spoonful of ash from the hearth, maybe a dash of vinegar if she had any left. Then she unwrapped the cloths. They were folded tightly in an old apron, wrapped twice, tied with string, hidden beneath the laundry pile in her chest. She always opened them gently, slowly, never rushed, never noisy. Each cloth was unfurled, rinsed, rubbed between her knuckles until the blood loosened its grip. She didn't scrub too hard. The fabric had to last. There was no soap. Not really. Just ash and elbow grease. When she finished washing, she wrung them out with practiced strength, arms aching from repetition. The water turned reddish-grey, cloudy like stormed-over milk. She tossed it out the back door. Not in the front, never near the well. She knew better. The drying came next. She never used the clothesline outside. That was for shirts, sheets, and baby shifts. Items meant to be seen, fluttering like flags of domestic pride. The menstrual cloths were not for display, so she improvised. She strung a thin cord behind the kitchen curtain, stretched it from one wooden beam to another, just high enough that no one would brush against it, low enough to be hidden by the linen drape. Then, one by one, she draped the cloths along it, folding them gently over the line. No pins, no flapping in the wind, just quiet drying in the still air of the night. Sometimes, the scent of iron and vinegar mingled with the warm smell of stew that lingered in the stone walls. It wasn't unpleasant, just earthy, just human. But if someone came near, she'd murmur about onions or burnt herbs and hope they didn't look too closely. She left them there while she slept. Occasionally, she'd wake up before the others to check if they were dry. If they weren't, she'd pull them down anyway, press them between rags, or wave them briefly over the hearth. Anything to make them disappear before the sun rose, because if a neighbour saw them, or her brother-in-law, or the young boy sent to fetch bread that wasn't just embarrassment, that was exposure. She wasn't afraid of being scolded. She was afraid of being discussed. That cloth drying in the corner could become a story, a joke, a whispered comment about her cleanliness, her fertility, her womanhood, in her world. That kind of talk had weight. It could reach the church pews, the marketplace, her husband's ears. So she dried in silence, and she folded them, once dry, with the care of someone handling fine parchment. Each cloth was pressed flat, corners matched, then stacked in a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread, tied again with string, and placed deep in her clothing chest beneath winter shawls or baby clothes no longer in use. No labels, no markings, just instinct. Some women kept theirs in ceramic pots, others wrapped them in old pillowcases. One neighbour sewed a hidden pocket into her mattress. They shared these methods in hushed tones, over lentils and tea, never during gatherings, always one-on-one, because menstrual cloths were like secrets necessary, recurrent, but never spoken too loudly. When a cloth began to fray, she'd sigh, sit by the fire and trim the edges. If it tore beyond use, she'd cut it into smaller rags for floor washing or polishing pewter. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was honoured, either. These were working cloths, lifelines made of thread. They were hers, and yet not hers. Her daughters would use them too, eventually. She didn't dread that moment, but she didn't look forward to it either. Not because it was shameful, but because she remembered the ache, the learning curve, the discomfort of folding fabric into place while pretending it didn't hurt, didn't stain, didn't interrupt everything else she was expected to do. She'd teach them, of course, in time, but not yet. For now, the drying rack stayed hidden. The cloths hung like whispers behind the curtain, each one a small testament to survival, to silence, to invention born from need. When winter came and the air turned wet, drying took longer. Sometimes the cloths froze on the line, stiff and heavy with half-dried blood. She'd bring them down, wrap them in flannel, tuck them near the hearthstones. The house would smell like copper and ash. No one would comment. Or, if they did, they'd stop when she looked up with that quiet stare. The one that said, "You know exactly what this is, and you'll say nothing." In those moments, she felt ancient, like the hundreds of women before her who had done the same, who had bent over buckets in stone kitchens, who had folded cloths in candlelight, who had tucked secrets into drawers lined with cedar chips. There was dignity in the method, not pride, exactly, but competence, mastery over a bodily truth that the world refused to acknowledge. Her drying rack held no lace, no embroidery, no scent of roses, but it held knowledge, fabric that had been boiled, worn, stained, saved. She counted on it, trusted it more than she trusted her reflection, more than she trusted any blessing spoken over her in Latin. The cloths never failed her, and so she gave them care. At night, when the fire was down to coals and the rest of the house shifted into dreams, she'd glance once more at the curtain, not to admire, just to check. Still there, still drying, still hers. Sometimes, when the nights were warmer and the window shutter rattled from a restless breeze, she'd sit beside the curtain and listen to the soft drip of the drying cloths. There was something meditative about it, like the ticking of a clock that no one else could hear. Each drop falling from soaked linen to clay floor marked time differently, not in minutes, but in dignity preserved. She never spoke of these evenings, to anyone, even her closest friend, one she'd known since girlhood, who had held her hand through labour pains and shared broth when food was scarce, was not told about the line behind the curtain. Some silences weren't shame, they were protection, like how you never spoke aloud a prayer you weren't ready for someone else to hear. On rare occasions, when her husband woke during her midnight routine and asked what she was doing, she'd say simply, laundry. He never questioned. Men, she'd learned, preferred mystery when it came to women's maintenance. They wanted you clean, pleasant, composed, but never wanted to know how you got there. And so, she let them believe in magic, but there was nothing magical about boiling blood from fabric, or folding stained rags with raw knuckles, or praying they would dry fast enough not to mildew. No, it wasn't magic. It was endurance, and it was everywhere, woven into the lives of women from cottages and castles alike. Some women, she'd heard, burned their cloths when they grew too thin, not out of disrespect, but as a kind of offering, returning them to ash, letting the fire erase what water could not. She liked that idea, in theory, but she could never bring herself to do it. Even the worst cloths, the ones threadbare and impossible to mend, were kept for something. A dust rag, a floor pad, a memory. She once stitched a tiny red thread along the corner of each cloth knot to mark it as menstrual, but to distinguish them from other linens, a secret code. If someone ever found them, they'd assume it was decoration, but she knew better. That red thread meant survival. It meant, this is mine, and I have made it enough. As the years went on, she found herself using fewer cloths. Her cycle slowed, grew lighter. Then, eventually, it didn't come at all. She folded the cloths one final time and placed them in the back of her cupboard, not to throw away, but to remember. They were part of her story, part of her silence, and silence, she knew, was not the absence of meaning. Sometimes it was the most powerful thing she had. Protection was a colour, a layer, a habit. There were certain dresses she never wore on ordinary days. They weren't special, exactly. Not festive, not embroidered, not reserved for feast days or market strolls, but they were purposeful. Heavy skirts, dark colours, thicker linen, more folds than necessary. They were her blood day clothes. She kept them folded at the bottom of her chest, not with her Sunday dress or her work apron, but tucked beneath older shawls and winter leggings. They were soft from years of wear, but still strong. The fabrics were heavier not to flatter her shape, but to shield it. Because when the bleeding came, she needed armour. No one told her to keep a separate set of clothes. It wasn't something taught in a formal sense. You learned it by watching, by noticing which dresses your mother wore when her face tightened in that silent, familiar way, by recognising the days she moved slower, the skirts she layered higher, the silence she wore alongside the linen. Her own mother had worn a thick brown skirt with a faded band of red near the hem. The colour had likely been bright once, now dulled by years of boiling and blood. Her mother never spoke of it, but it reappeared like clockwork. And so, without being told, she understood that skirt was for when the body became a burden. She inherited that logic, if not the clothes. When she began to bleed each month, she assembled her own setter-faded black overdress, once part of her wedding trousseau, a dark blue petticoat she'd been gifted during her second pregnancy, a linen shift she had stained beyond repair, now repurposed for discretion. Each item was chosen not for beauty but for cover. Light colours were out of the question. Pale cloth betrayed her. Even the faintest spotting showed like spilled wine. She had once worn a grey apron on the wrong day and spent the afternoon walking backward to hide the mark on the back of her skirt. She never made that mistake again. Darker fabrics offered safety. They didn't erase the blood, but they disguised it. And in a world where a stain could earn a comment, a laugh, or a whispered insult, disguise was survival. The clothing had to fit differently too. On those days, she bloated. Her belly swelled slightly, her thighs ached, her body became foreign, so her blood day clothes were looser, less tailored, easier to move in. The waistband of her skirt had been let out by 2 finger widths. Her shift had a hidden tuck under the arms, sewn by her own hand in the quiet after a painful cycle. She wore more layers, even in summer, an extra apron, a longer underskirt, sometimes even wool socks. Not because she was cold, but because the act of layering made her feel more contained, more secured inside herself. The clothes didn't take the pain away, but they gave her a sense of control over something that rarely offered it. They were her privacy, made visible, and though no one ever said, "That's her blood day dress," women around her knew. They had their own. And if a friend showed up wearing her thickest skirt and her hair tied tighter than usual, no one asked why she looked pale or walked slowly. They simply passed her the kettle first, or gave her the softer chair, or best of all, said nothing at all, and men rarely noticed. They didn't recognise the slight shift in colour, the added shawl, the absence of her lighter blouse. If they did, they assumed it was due to weather, mood, or modesty. And she let them think that. Let them stay blissfully unaware of the language women spoke through clothing. Her daughters, when the time came, picked up the custom without needing to be taught. She saw her eldest quietly begin separating her clothes, setting aside one older smock and 2 darker underskirts. She didn't ask questions, just folded them neatly and placed them near the fire to air out. She remembered the first time her own skirt caught a full stain. She'd been 13, new to bleeding, too slow to change the cloth. The blood had soaked through, bloomed like a red flower across her backside. No one saw, but she felt it. Walked the rest of the day clutching her apron behind her, burning with shame. That night she cried, not from pain but from the feeling of being betrayed by her own body. Her mother, quiet as always, didn't scold her, just brought out an old wool skirt from the bottom drawer and said, "Use this next time." That was the whole lesson. No sermon, just fabric and foresight. From that moment on, she never underestimated the power of one extra layer. The smell of her blood day clothes was different, not unpleasant, just lived in. They carried the scent of old vinegar, sun-dried cloth, a trace of ash, sometimes a mint or thyme from the sachets she tucked between the folds to cover the scent of iron. The herbs weren't luxury, they were strategy, and she washed these clothes differently, just 2, not with the rest of the family's linen. She soaked them alone, at night, usually, scrubbed them longer, checked for stains beneath candlelight, hung them behind thicker sheets on the line so no one would see. She had sewn a second loop into the waistband of her apron, an extra hook to double tie it, just in case. These were small things, but protection was never just one act. It was a habit, a pattern, a shadow of thought behind every fold of fabric, and it gave her peace, not joy, not exactly, but peace. She didn't dread her cycle as some women did, because she had prepared. Her cloths were ready, her clothes were ready, her body still hurt, still leaked, still made her feel raw and heavy and tired, but she had armour. And in a world where women often went without any defence at all, a dark skirt and a thicker apron were better than a shield. As she aged, her set of blood day clothes changed. Some items were retired, others altered. She passed one skirt to her younger sister, cut another into rags. The most loyal pieces she kept quietly, respectfully, even when her bleeding slowed, then stopped. When the day finally came that she no longer needed them, She didn't celebrate. She folded the skirt one last time, tied the bundle with twine, placed it at the bottom of her trunk. She didn't need it anymore, but someone else might, and when they did, she'd show them. Not with fanfare, not with lectures, just with fabric, just with layers, just with love. Because for all the things women passed down recipes, songs, prayers, the Blood Day clothes mattered just as much. Not because they were beautiful, but because they protected. And protection, in a woman's life, is often the first language of care. Protection was a colour, a layer, a habit, and it was hers. No one asked. She kept going. There were days when her body ached in a way she couldn't name. Not sickness, not exhaustion, just pain low, heavy, coiled beneath her ribs, tugging at her back, pressing into her legs with a dull rhythm like a second heartbeat. She knew its shape, its timing, its inevitability. But she never called it anything, because no one ever gave her the language. No one told her that menstrual pain had a word, or that it was something other women felt too. She learned it by surviving it. It arrived quietly, like a tide that slipped into her bones during the night. She would wake with a tightness in her belly, a sharp cramp under the curve of her hip, a heat that pulsed without fever. She didn't cry out. There was no use. Pain was not a subject in her world. It was a background noise. She never told her husband. Not once. He didn't ask, and she didn't offer. If she winced while kneeling to pull bread from the oven, he assumed she'd burned her wrist. If she paused on the stairs, hand pressed to her side, he thought she'd slipped. He never noticed the rhythm of her pain, how it returned each month. Like the moon, like the bleeding he never saw and never wanted to hear about. If she ever looked tired, he might suggest she rest, but not for long, just a moment. He'd say, "Then come help with the baby." And she would, because what else was there to do? There were no pills, no hot water bottles, no heating pads humming quietly under wool blankets. There were stones, warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth. She would place one against her lower belly, hold it with both hands like a fragile bowl, and breathe slowly as it cooled. Sometimes she tied it in place with an old apron, wore it like armour beneath her dress. It didn't fix the pain, but it gave her something to hold against it. Other times, she chewed dried leaves, yarrow, raspberry, feverfew, bitterness blooming on her tongue, sharp and dusty. Did it help? She couldn't be sure, but it was something to do, and doing was always better than nothing, because she still had chores, still had mouths to feed, floors to sweep, children to dress. Pain or no pain, the lentils wouldn't boil themselves. She might rest for a moment, lean against the doorway, close her eyes at the table, pretend to be checking the bread, but it was never for long, because no one else would step in. Her absence would leave a silence too loud to ignore, and so she moved, slowly, steadily, wincing only when no one could see, when the pain peaked, sharp and sudden, a blade twisting through her lower belly. She would stop, grip the edge of the sink or the corner of the bed, and wait. Wait for the wave to pass. Then she would breathe, straighten, and continue. There was no praise for this, no recognition. It wasn't seen as resilience. It was simply what women did. If she'd ever admitted how much it hurt, they might have called her fragile, lazy, fussy. So she said nothing, smiled through it when necessary, bit her lip when it got too loud inside her, and at night, when the house was quiet and her body throbbed like a bruise, she curled into herself. No one came to rub her back. No one brought her tea. There was no hot bath waiting. Just the same blanket, the same mat, the same thudding ache that would wake her before the rooster. She once asked her mother, years ago, if the pain ever went away. Her mother had shrugged. "You get used to it," she said. That was the only answer she ever got. She believed it too. Not because the pain lessened, but because her capacity grew around it, like a tree bending with the wind instead of breaking. She built a life with pain as one of the walls, and she was not alone. She saw it in other women, the way they shifted their weight from foot to foot while stirring soup, the way they moved slower certain days, the way their eyes turned glassy as they sewed. They all carried it. No one spoke of it. Once, during a rare gathering, she heard an older woman mutter, "The devil dances in my belly this week," and another nodded without a word. That was as close as they ever came to naming it. The pain was not just physical, it came with shame. with silence, with the expectation that it was her problem alone, that to mention it would be indecent, weak, selfish. So she learned to carry it gracefully. She washed the bloody cloths with aching arms. She bent to scrub the floor even when her spine felt split. She lifted the toddler even when her insides screamed. And when she couldn't take another step, she sat quietly by the hearth, folding laundry, eyes glazed with fatigue. But she didn't cry, because crying would make it real, and real things needed to be answered. And she knew no one would answer this. Not the priest, not her husband, not even the other women, because they all knew the rule. You bled, you hurt, you kept going. She dreamed once of a room with warm water and soft towels and someone whispering, "It's okay to rest." But she woke with her jaw clenched and a stain on her shift, and so the dream was folded away with the rest of the things she didn't speak of. There were moments, brief ones, when she did allow herself softness, a slice of bread with honey, a walk in the garden, pressing her palm to her belly and whispering, "I know," not to stop the pain, but to witness it, because if no one else would say it, at least she could. The pain had no name in her world, no remedy, no sympathy, but it had her, and she held it quietly, fiercely, every month, without fail. No one asked. She kept going. Cleanliness wasn't learned, it was copied in silence. She learned by watching. There was no instruction, no gentle voice at the edge of her bed explaining what to do when blood appeared, no little book tucked beneath the mattress, no basket of cloths prepared in advance. Just eyes, just repetition, just silence. Her mother never sat her down, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know how. Maybe no one had ever taught her. Maybe she thought that's just the way women came to know by absorbing pain without name, duty without praise, and rituals without explanation. So when the blood first came, the girl didn't scream. She was 11. She stared at the stain on her shift dark, wet, warm, and thought maybe something had broken inside her. Her legs trembled, but she didn't cry. She stood still, waiting for the shame to pass. It didn't. Her mother noticed eventually. She always did. But instead of words, she just handed her a folded cloth and said, "Here," then turned back to the fire. That was the whole lesson. From that moment on, she watched everything. Watched how her mother rinsed cloths with one hand while stirring soup with the other. Watched how she scrubbed under her arms with vinegar-soaked rags. Watched how she kept certain garments folded tightly in the back of the drawer. How she disappeared behind a curtain for just a few minutes each morning. Her mother never explained, never pointed and said, "This is how women stay clean. This is how we keep our bodies ours." Instead, the girl pieced it together, like sewing a dress from scraps, learning slowly, painfully, with stitches that sometimes held and sometimes tore open again. She remembered burning herself once trying to boil water for a cloth wipe. The pot tipped too fast, the water splashed, and the skin on her wrist blistered. She didn't say a word, just wrapped it and kept wiping, because she believed, like so many before her, that suffering was part of the ritual. Some girls weren't so lucky. Some had no mother to watch. They learned from older cousins, or whispers at the market, or trial and error. Some guessed wrong. Some stained dresses so badly they never wore them again. Some were scolded for leaving rags in the wash. Some were punished for smelling wrong, sitting wrong, bleeding too obviously. And then there were those whose mothers were there but didn't know how to teach, because they were too ashamed, or too hardened, or too afraid to speak of blood and breasts and wiping in a house where men listened through thin walls. So those girls learned from no one, and they passed that silence on. She once met a woman who didn't know she could reuse cloths. She'd been throwing them out, hiding them in the woods, buried under moss and stone, afraid someone would find them. She thought she was the only one who bled. She thought something was wrong with her. When the truth came out, she wept. Not because she was embarrassed, but because she realised how long she'd been alone in something so human. That moment stayed with her, because it showed her how much was lost, not to time, not to poverty, but to silence. There were no schools for women's knowledge, no open-air teachings, no lectures on how to care for a body that the world preferred to pretend didn't exist. Everything was passed through observation, through gesture, through cloths folded a certain way, tucked in certain drawers, dried in the corner when no one was looking. And if you missed those signs, if you didn't look closely enough, you learned late, you learned hard. She sometimes wondered how many mistakes could have been avoided, how many infections, how much shame, how many tears if someone had simply said the words aloud. If someone had looked at her at 11 or 12 and said, "This is your body. It is not dirty. It is not wrong. It is not something to hide from yourself." But no one did. Instead, they taught through absence. They taught her to lower her voice when speaking of cloths, to never ask for more washing water than seemed appropriate, to pretend that needing space, needing care, needing warmth was weakness. And so she grew clever, quietly. She timed her washing for when the house was asleep. She marked her cloths with stitches only she could interpret. She used herbs not just for scent, but for signal if the rag smelled of mint. It meant not to disturb her. Her daughters learned in the same way, not from a speech, not from a lesson, but from glimpses, from footsteps across cold stone, from the sight of her wiping her arms slowly behind a curtain, from how she folded her blood day clothes twice instead of as once. One day, her youngest daughter brought her a bowl of water without being asked, didn't say anything, just placed it by her side, folded the cloth, and went back to bed. That was the moment she realised she had taught something after all, even without words, even through the silence. Still, it haunted her, the gaps in her knowledge. She didn't know how women kept lice from spreading in royal courts. She didn't know what herbs to use for severe pain. She didn't know if there was a better way to clean old blood from cloth. She only knew her way, and hoped it was enough, because not every girl had someone to watch, not every woman had someone to copy. And the price of not knowing was carried in the body in infections, in fear, in the quiet shame that followed them through every stage of life. So she kept her routines visible, if only within the safety of her own home, not flaunted but not entirely hidden, either. She let her daughters see her care for herself, let them witness the folding, the rinsing, the preparation. She wanted them to have more than she had, more than a cloth handed wordlessly by a fire. She wanted them to understand that cleanliness was not about being presentable for others. It was about staying close to oneself, about honouring a body that the world constantly tried to ignore. Because in the end, the worst lesson was the one not taught at all, and the only thing more painful than silence was repeating it, again, and again, and again. Cleanliness wasn't learned. It was copied in silence, and if she could help it, her daughters would remember the cloth. Yes, but also the hands that taught them how to use it. Lao, haka. VC. In a world where everything else was taken, a woman could still keep herself clean with a cloth and time. She didn't own much. The house wasn't hers. The tools she used were borrowed. Even the food she prepared each day was counted, measured, rationed out by others. But the cloth, that simple square of linen, damp and fraying at the edges, that was hers. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a small, deliberate act of resistance. In a world where so much was taken from women, their choices, their privacy, their time, their very voices, this was one thing she refused to surrender: the right to care for her body. And that right began with cloth and water. No one else dictated how she wiped her skin at the end of the day. No one scheduled when she cleaned behind her ears or smoothed a damp rag across her collarbone. These small motions belonged to no one but her. There were no rules, no judgment, no interruptions. She didn't need a reason. She didn't need permission. She just did it. Every wipe was an assertion. This body is mine, and I will tend to it. It was not vanity. It was not luxury. It was dignity. The quiet, powerful kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. It lives in silence, in repetition, in every wrinkle of fabric pressed gently to the skin. She carried the cloth like others carried heirlooms. It had no embroidery, no monogram, no precious thread, but it had meaning, it had memory, it had ownership. In a life filled with demands, cook this, clean that, feed them, wait here, this one action belonged entirely to her. She wiped her body not to please anyone, not to present herself, but because it grounded her in herself, in when she sat alone by the hearth, cloth in hand, steam rising faintly from the basin, the rest of the world fell away. The noises, the orders, the eyes, none of it reached her there. There, she was not wife, not mother, not servant, not woman of the house. She was simply her, and she was clean. Not spotless, not perfumed, but clean in the way that mattered most by her own terms. Sometimes she thought about how many women across the centuries had done the same thing, sat by the same kind of fire, folded the same kind of cloth, dipped it in water, warmed with scraps of wood, and reclaimed a sliver of selfhood through the simple act of wiping. It was not something history books recorded, no chronicler wrote. She wiped her feet and felt like herself again, but they should have. Because in those quiet, daily rituals was the whole secret how women held themselves together when everything else tried to pull them apart. The cloth kept her anchored. When grief threatened to scatter after a miscarriage, after a lost sister, after a fight that left her hollow, she still wiped, slowly, as if the cloth could draw pain out through the pores, as if cleaning her body could calm her mind, and often it did. She didn't need to be seen to feel seen. The act of tending was enough. There were days when she felt invisible, not ignored, erased, her labour taken for granted, her presence blurred at the edges, but the cloth never overlooked her. It touched every inch of her skin. It asked for nothing in return. It bore witness to her without condition. And that, in a life of silence, was everything. There was a power in keeping clean when the world expected you to fall apart. There was power in saying, I may not be listened to. I may not be honoured, but I will still wipe my own arms, behind my ears, the backs of my knees. I will still choose how I enter the night. She had seen women give up, seen their eyes dull, their hands lose purpose, their bodies sag into a kind of weariness that couldn't be fixed by rest. The first thing to go was usually the cloth. The habit slipped. The water stayed cold. The rags stayed folded. And she understood. She did. But she also knew when you lost the cloth. You lost the last thread of control. So she kept hers ready, folded in a small basket, next to the hearth, wrapped in twine. She checked it daily, re-hemmed it when it tore, scented it with rosemary when she could, and when she couldn't, she used it plain, because dignity didn't need decoration. When her daughter watched her one evening, watched as she dipped the cloth and pressed it gently to her chest, didn't speak, just looked. And the woman met her eyes and thought, let her remember this. Let her remember that cleanliness isn't for men to admire. It isn't for neighbours to approve. It isn't for God or custom or punishment. It is a right claimed not by law, but by cloth, a right no one gave them, so they took it quietly, every night, in every village, in every century. And someday, when her daughter grew and bled and broke and rebuilt, she would reach for the same basin and the same motion and the same folded cloth, and she would understand. Not because anyone told her, but because her mother lived it, wiped it, claimed it. In a world that takes and never asks, to wipe your body is to answer I'm still here, still clean, still whole, still mine. And that was enough. Not perfect, not celebrated, but hers. No one taught her how to do it. No one ever said, this is how you care for your body when the world isn't watching. But she figured it out, with a cloth, with a bowl, with time. She learned that dignity doesn't arrive in thunder. It comes quietly like steam from warm water, like the rustle of linen in the dark, and in a life where everything was borrowed space, time. Breath, what she did for her own body was one of the only things that belonged to her, not perfect, not celebrated, but hers. She never told anyone about her routines. There was no point. They weren't impressive. They weren't luxurious. They were simple, repetitive, ordinary, but that was the point. The cloth, the hairbrush, the basin by the hearth, the corner behind the curtain, the sound of water trickling and the scent of dried herbs rising from hot linen. These were not accidents. They were choices, and in those choices small, consistent, unspoken, she built something close to sacred. Each night, after the fire had faded and the house had sunk into soft silence, she would open the drawer, slowly, gently. Her hands knew what to do. She unfolded the cloth, checked it, dipped it into warm water, not too hot, just enough to remind her skin it was alive. Then she wiped, not for display, not for approval, but because that's how she reminded herself I am still here. She wiped her face, her arms, her chest, behind her ears, beneath her chin, the places no one else ever thought to touch. She did it slowly, not as a task, but as a conversation with her own flesh. "I see you," the cloth whispered. "I haven't forgotten you." And her body answered, wordless, grateful, tired, enduring. Then she combed her hair, one long braid undone, then gently teased through with an old wooden brush. It caught on knots formed during the day under her scarf, against her sweat, but she was patient. She had learned not to tug. Each stroke smoothed not just the hair, but the noise inside her. And finally, she folded the cloth again, neat, with care, placed it back in the drawer, closed it. That was the end of her ritual. It took 10 minutes, sometimes less, sometimes more. No one ever noticed, but that didn't matter, because not being seen didn't mean it wasn't powerful. The world rarely noticed women like her. It praised beauty, performance, elegance, not maintenance, not resilience, not the ritual of quiet care. But she noticed, and that made all the difference. When people talked about power, they spoke of kings and laws and armies. She thought about cloth, about choice, about wiping her skin after a long day and knowing that no one could take that from her. It wasn't armour, it wasn't rebellion, it was something softer, something deeper. It was permission to feel clean, to feel real, to feel herself, when everything else tried to rename her. And so, she returned to the ritual, day after day, year after year, until it became less of an act and more of a pulse something that lived inside her. A woman brushing her hair at night is not a spectacle, but it is a sermon. A woman wiping behind her ears with rosemary-scented cloth is not a revolution, but it is a refusal to vanish. She never wrote these things down. They wouldn't have fit on paper, but her daughters knew, her granddaughters noticed. They carried the cloth forward, they added their own gestures, their own herbs, their own silence, because what mattered wasn't the method. What mattered was the ritual, the return, the ownership. In a world where the body of a woman was often legislated, watched, blamed, broken, she kept something untouched, not her skin, not her hair, but her right to tend them without apology. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't praised, but she was whole, and she belonged to herself. That was enough. So tonight, as you settle beneath your own blanket, worn, or waiting for comfort, picture her a woman in a room lit only by coals, a soft cloth in her hand, her head bowed slightly, not in submission, but in stillness, in choice. She wipes her neck, her arms, she braids her hair. No one sees, but that doesn't make it small, that makes it sacred. If this quiet story made you feel something, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or a piece of yourself you forgot, take a moment, subscribe to Boring Before Sleep, for stories like this, for women like her, for moments like these, not perfect, not celebrated, but yours, mine, ours, forever.